One thing I've been thinking about starting to do on YouTube, because I was a literature student and I used to read a lot of books, and it's kind of what I liked to do in high school was read a lot of about like history and literature and stuff like that. And then I kind of got away from it the last few years. So something I've been thinking about doing, maybe on a different channel, is just start to do like a lot of book reviews. Maybe do like stuff with actual quotes, so people who don't have time. Like, I wish I could know more about, like, like maybe just hear some quotes from different books that are interesting that I know I won't have time to read. Maybe some newer stuff that maybe when you see some quotes or summaries of it, you might be more inclined to check it out. But one book that I've been reading the past few days is called Nonsense on Stilts by Massimo Pigliucci. So the book is pretty much what you would think it's about. It says how to tell science from bunk. And the guy is his background. It says Massimo is professor of philosophy at the City University of New York. I don't know. I guess he's like a philosopher. But basically, what the book is, like, table of contents, give some idea about it. So he's talking a lot about like hard science versus soft science, which is interesting. He talks about a lot of like the methodologies that are used in the hard sciences versus the softer sciences that study more behavior. And like one of the surprising facts from there is he shows like sort of like how much like fluctuations and errors there are between like like the hard sciences like particle physics versus psychology. And a lot of people think like the evidence in psychology is like more unreliable, and he talks about that's actually not true in terms of just like variation between the data. And he gets more into discussion of like what really separates the hard sciences from the soft sciences is more the types of questions they're trying to answer and the types of causality they're trying to get at, and the complexity of what they're trying to study. So he has a nice discussion about that. So that's chapter 1. Chapter 2 is called Almost Science, and that talks about history, and he does an interesting analysis of this book called Germs, Guns, and Steel, which I never read, but I know was popular a few years ago. What I like about this book is he goes through a lot of into detail. Like, he definitely, it's not just sort of like principles. I think part of his thesis is that science isn't that clear. It's not like he talks about Karl Popper and then a couple other philosophers who have tried to tie science down to like particular sort of method or statement that can make science what it is, and usually those have come up short. But like a lot of science is more keeping your mind open and then using evidence and logic and just keeping a certain amount of openness of mind to adjust your hypotheses and then to actually build up theories as much as possible. So it kind of shows like the process. So yeah, so the first chapter is more hard science, soft science. Chapter 2 is about subjects that are sort of scientific and sort of where we draw the line. So it's like evolutionary psychology, and then he talks about history using more of a scientific methodology. And chapter 3 is about pseudoscience. And that's probably my favorite chapter so far, just because he has a breakdown of this horrible movie that came out in 2004, I think. I remember like I went to go see this, and like I really didn't want to see it because I was actually studying physics at that time, and I actually became a physics major for a year, and I wish I would have stayed in that major, but I had personal problems and had to get out of that. But if I could go back to college, I would be a physics major. But I was studying physics and thinking a lot about it, and like there's no bullshit in physics if you actually take it. When you're studying it, you realize it's very hard. Like, anybody who takes physics and gets gets into anything that's really math based, realize you can't really fake it, and you also realize very fast that even for like simple mechanics problems, your intuition can't necessarily guide you. So this movie came out. This is on page 95 of his. Oh, this is actually not in the pseudoscience chapter. This is in the chapter after pseudoscience, where it talks about the media. Actually, the pseudoscience chapter was kind of boring because it was like about UFOs and stuff that's like obviously ridiculous if you try to use reason and evidence. My favorite part in this book so far, I think, just because of personal resonance, was this from chapter 4 called Blame the Media. And it's on page 95, and it's analyzing this movie that came out called What the Bleep Do We Know? And like I live in Southern California, and like we have a lot of new agey people here, and like I don't know why quantum mechanics was being tossed around a lot like in the early 2000s. Like right now, like there's still the same debates going on. Like the Higgs boson was supposedly discovered. Like they have to wait to make sure that it was actually what they thought it was. And I believe, I don't know like the full theory of it, but I believe it's supposed to. It's like a gravity particle, and it's sort of fits the equation for how gravity works. And I'd really like to learn more about it and to find out sort of like, because I thought it was like, oh, this discovery is true, and I heard some stuff on NPR about it, and then I've heard, well, we don't really know, like it's going to take a while to know for sure. But anyways, my point is, like in the earlier 2000s, I don't know what was going on, but people were tossing quantum mechanic ideas around a lot as some sort of like justification for like basically anything you wanted to be true about the universe. You could kind of like evoke quantum mechanics to somehow like, even though you don't know anything about quantum mechanics, and most people don't, like it would take years and years to understand like how their predictions and theory actually work. People were just tossed around these ideas like, it was fine, yeah, well, quantum mechanics sort of like justifies this. Yeah, I think like the world kind of has this uncertainty about it, and like we just don't know. Like maybe if I just like open my mind up, then I'll like, because of like the uncertainty principle, then like I'll just sort of like have access to something else. Like there's all this like nonsense going around. And then this movie came out called What the Bleep Do We Know in 2004. And he just has a great analysis of it. Like he goes through and like picks apart like 4 of the most ridiculous stories. And then I found a great video on YouTube that I'll link to. I was gonna make, because I after I read this chapter, I was like remembering that movie, and I remember going to see it with some people who like were convinced by it, and I was like, it's kind of hard to like. It's like, even though you might think something is completely BS and just ridiculous, it's a lot of times hard to know like exactly how you can convey to people that it's wrong, especially when you saw it at the movie theater and you can't pause it. And like my brain just like melted halfway through it. I was like, this is just like, there's so many lies and so many distortions. So I was gonna make a video about it after reading this chapter in this book that does a good job sort of showing how people can abuse science through different sorts of, basically like you make a claim and then leap to another claim that's just completely unsupported. And that's basically just how it works. Or you can use a lot of rhetoric or like imagery. So I started watching the movie again because I was like, oh yeah, I wonder how did that movie actually kind of like confuse the audience enough to get people to believe it, and what sorts of mix of scientific claims were being used, and what was it trying to justify. And it was basically like, I rewatched part of it, and it kind of like floods you with like tons of scientific questions like right away. Like at the intro, like philosophical questions, not scientific questions. And then meanwhile they kind of mix in like a lot of scientific facts, but they're like scientific sort of like statements that like scientists would agree with, but for very different reasons. It's kind of being mixed in the intro, and then they mix in like this mysticism and sort of this idea that whatever, because everything in reality has to come through our subjectivity, that somehow that means everything we know is somehow subjective, and so therefore we can like kind of think whatever we want. So I'll put a link to this video because I was gonna make one, like, cause I've been wanting to make some videos like criticizing stuff like that. That's just ridiculous. I thought it would be a good practice, but someone already beat me to it and did a really good job analyzing the movie and just tearing it apart. Well, I'll just read one part from this book because it's really funny. So first he says, this is on page 96, he says, the central idea of the movie is that the foundation of reality is to be found in thought and consciousness, not matter and energy, and that therefore the best we can do is to solve our problems is to rethink reality itself. So that's really like the move that people try to make a lot of times who are con artists, especially like in like psychotherapy, when people want to sort of feel better, because it's true, like if you come up with a new conception of the world, like it can get results and make you feel better. But a lot of that's like more on like a practical scale. Like just because you think like the moon's made out of some chemical that scientists don't know about doesn't mean that what's in your head. Like if you think the moon's made out of cheese, or you think it's made out of ice, and like scientists don't know, I mean that's just not true. You know, so there's a difference. I mean that's a bad example, but there's obviously a difference between what you hope to be true, maybe about like your own experience, and then like what science knows. I mean, it's obvious, but somehow people manage to slip to make these statements that like rely on science to confuse people. And so there's actually like a type of philosophy called Stoic philosophy that I learned a little bit about a long time ago, and it's an Epictetus was one of the old Stoic philosophers, and I've thought about maybe going back because I got kind of caught up in what's called idealist philosophy for a little while, which is like Hegel, and it's actually the same idea. It's kind of that we can know reality somehow through subjectivity and through subjective experience. And in some ways that's kind of true. Like when you're doing math, I think this is how Hegel sort of got me on a slippery slope, because when you're doing logic and math, in some ways that's occurring in your mind. So in some ways it's true that like even scientific knowledge is subjective, but science doesn't actually care if the math and the logic are, it does follow mathematical and logical rules, but as a lot of physicists will talk about, you can create like crazy theories that get way off from what reality actually is through math and certain types of logic, so you have to be careful. But there's like a type of idealism that is kind of like sneakier, that a lot of philosophers in the 60s were using, that was based on Hegel. And it's just kind of like a sneakier version of it that you gotta watch out for. But there's a hilarious part in the movie that's like the best example of idealist, like just total abuse of the subjective idea. And let me just read this part if I can find it. And it happens pretty early in the movie. If you've never seen this movie, it's worth watching as an example of like the most horrendous abuse of scientific knowledge. And a lot of people love it still. So it's like, I don't know how to respond to people like that, but a lot of people that are like that are the people who shop at like New Age shops and like believe in astrology and card reading and stuff, so it's kind of hard to have a rational conversation with them. So this is on page 98, and he says, one of my absolute favorite bits of the movie arrives when one Candace Pert, who is billed as a former scientist and current guru, says rather matter-of-factly that Native Americans literally could not see Columbus's ships because they could not make sense of such artifacts within their cultural reality. This is a quintessentially extreme postmodernist position in which we do not just construct reality out of social intercourse, but we literally cannot perceive any reality that is not part of such social intercourse, even if we are about to be wiped out by some of the consequences of this allegedly undetectable reality. So that's like, I just recommend watching this movie, What the Bleep. There's a link to a full version of it, and there's this scene like early on, like within the first 20 minutes, where it's saying that, and the movie actually visually represents this. It shows the Native Americans looking at the sea, and it's saying like all they could see were ripples on the sea. They couldn't even see the ship. They couldn't see the physical ship because they didn't have a concept of a ship. They couldn't see the ship. And so like then the shaman, because he was like wiser for some reason, could like suddenly he could start to make out the ship. So there's like this image in the movie of like ripples on the sea, but you can't see anything, and then the shaman could somehow start to see it, and then he like informed his group of like the entity of a ship, and then they could perceive the ship. So I mean, it doesn't even make sense when I'm talking about this. Like, you gotta see it, and it's just like the best analogy for like the worst form of idealist thought. Like, and what's frightening is like there's this branch of philosophy called postmodernism that I kind of got into for a while, because some of it's kind of relevant, like in terms of like media studies. Like, there's a certain aspect of like the reality that we're all in now that's like there's no substance behind it, and a lot of that's so like postmodern thought kind of comes out of the sickness that is like the unstable truth in a media culture. But that doesn't mean that that's how like reality works. So like in a way, like postmodern philosophy is sort of like, it just kind of is the logic of a very mediated, entertainment-based society. But then they try to somehow say, because truth is always a little bit subjective in the sense that we have to process it through our brains, that therefore we can't know reality. So then they like suspend reality and they bracket it. And that's like the philosophical like mode, like you call it idealism or postmodernism or phenomenology. So that's kind of like the elitist. I don't know if I'd say elitist. It's kind of the fancy version of the like what's going on here, which is more like new agey. And but I like love this scene in this movie because like I've been kind of looking for an image and an example of just like the crudest form of this sort of branch of philosophy, and this was it. So I'll put a link to the video and the time that scene occurs if you want to check it out. And anyways, this book keeps going. It has parts about the media. It talks about the public role of intellectuals and scientists. It goes into some depth about like Carl Sagan and Stephen Jay Gould, which is interesting. It talks about science and politics. It has a nice analysis about the global warming, like 2 books. It goes into some depth about. One of them, I remember when this book came out and it was picked up by the right. It's by an economist who decided to write a 500-page book about global warming, and most scientists like thought it was ridiculous. And his ultimate claim was basically that the scientists were right. And like he kind of like slightly varies the fluctuation in the percentage that he thinks the scientists were wrong, but it's just kind of nonsense. And then he also talks about Al Gore's inconvenient truth, and how like he also was kind of taking science to an extreme. So it's a pretty balanced book, and I'm only on chapter 7. I'm kind of rambling, and that's just because I'm trying to practice, because I'm not used to talking about books like this. I used to do it all the time, but it's been a few years. So really what I'd like to start doing is making like videos with like quotes on the screen and imagery. Mainly like videos that I would want to watch, like about books like this, because this book came out in 2010. And like, I mean, realistically, like after you start working, you just don't have time to read stuff like this anymore unless you're an academic. And unfortunately, a lot of academics just in the humanities publish in really obscure journals. So a lot of their like research like doesn't really like even surface. So I thought it'd be kind of cool. Like, there's a lot of good stuff on YouTube for sort of hearing debates and stuff. I haven't found too much just like book reviews. So I'll probably start up another channel, start doing that, because I don't want to really like flood my guitar lessons with channel with stuff like this. But maybe I'll post some of those videos on here too. And then there's a really great section, like, because one of the reasons why I bought this was to sort of hear some analysis about what I would consider irrationalism and abuse of reason in academia, because it's a little bit frightening to me, like some of what I experienced. And mainly it's just people who have never studied science or done anything actually involving math who like to criticize it. I think in part because they feel like intimidated by it, and also like it is a little bit hard when we have to rely on experts to see if what we know is true, because it's so hard. Like, how do we know that these discoveries in quantum mechanics are real? Like, you have to rely on experts because it could take you a whole lifetime to figure out why that stuff's true, even if you have the disposition to do that. But near the end of this, I kind of jumped ahead. He does have a nice discussion about, like, Alan Sokol, who did a nice experiment sort of showing a lot of the nonsense that gets passed off as legitimate academic work. And the guy basically wrote some fake essays and then passed them off as real, and people didn't even check. It's an interesting thing to learn about. And then he also talks about this guy named Bruno Latour, who I was given some of his books, and like my interest in literature was mainly just because I like literature, and I think it's a great way to understand sort of the complexity of human life. A lot of people who write great books like have really thought about problems in their complexity, and they're not trying to lay it out in a way that's like, this is a statement we can make. It's kind of like trying to reveal things about reality that you've thought about in a way that you present sort of good models or situations where problems occur. And then the game of literature is kind of to understand like the history of like time periods and how like that was reflected through the work in part, and then also to sort of think about problems, like, and then you have to have discussion about it because there's not any absolute truth. But a lot of people in the humanities kind of like want to have a theory so they can compete with science. So one of the things they do is try to sort of say science doesn't really know that much, which is completely absurd considering like all the buildings they're in and all the devices they use in their car and pretty much all the medicine and everything that we really value in society as necessary or put the most value on because it's real and productive comes from science. But it's not to say humanities don't have a big role. Like, they do have a role, but the role should be more to try to, in my opinion, to sort of promote critical thinking based on like honestly weighing different types of evidence. And also part of critical thinking within moral and social problems is like kind of keeping a certain degree of uncertainty, but also having to actually make decisions. So like people swing to these different extremes within the humanities that I found really shocking, ultimately led me away from there. But one of the guys who I didn't know too much about is named Bruno Latour, and he like basically was trying to criticize science, and he has some really absurd ideas of just kind of about how science is dominating and sexist and a lot of weird stuff like that. And I was given one of his books by one of my friends who kind of was way more entrenched in that sort of just bizarre branch of what goes on in the humanities. So you could call it postmodernism, but I think it's a little bit unfair because I think postmodernism does have some valuable like contributions to make, but a lot of it's just complete nonsense. It's kind of like some people didn't want to draw the line, like, yeah, we're doing basically media studies, or we're doing text studies of artistic text, not like all texts, and we're not necessarily studying the structure of the human mind and stuff. But there's some good analysis of Bruno Latour, who's one of the guys who was trying to criticize science, and I think in the 80s. I was given one of his books, and it was just impossible to read. Like, it didn't have any actual science in it. It was just obnoxious, like basically word games. So it's fun to learn a little bit about him and find out kind of the background on that stuff. And then there's another guy who I remember reading, Karl Popper versus Paul Firebrand. Firebend? I don't know how to say his name. They had some debates. Basically, this Paul Firebend was just a really cynical character who also was basically, like, he even admitted that basically he was just trying to make money and to be confrontational for the sake of it. So I have some nice discussion about him, because he's another big figure of these kind of anti-rationalists who people who don't want to think about science like sort of evoke. And unfortunately, I got a little bit sucked into some of that, even though I had enough science to know better. And that's just because partly if you think about something all the time, like, it sort of starts to pervade how you do see reality, and you can sort of privilege like a certain angle of seeing things, even though it's like conflicting. So I don't know if you've ever heard of Paul Firebend, or however you say it. There's a nice talk about him, and that's pretty much it. So I was kind of rambling, but that's because I'm just practicing talking about books. So if you found this video and it's really annoying, like, I apologize for that, but I've sort of realized that the only way to get better at doing anything is just to do it. So I guess one bad thing about this book is the binding isn't good. My page just fell out. So I've actually been thinking maybe I should just start reading books on like a Kindle or an iPad. I'm just having a hard time making that leap to doing that, but at the same time I was thinking it might be kind of cool to do it on the iPad, so like you could do like a screencast easily, or like save quotes and then like send them over your computer or then edit them together. Cause I've been thinking about that, like a lot of the quotes in here, like I take notes and like highlight stuff, then I have to like recopy it and find it. So it might be kind of cool, like to actually, while you're reading, like I don't think you can do this on a Kindle, but on an iPad it would be easy to just take like a screenshot, then import it, or even like they have sort of screencasting programs in the iPad. Just make a video straight up in there and then upload it to YouTube. So that's it. I definitely recommend this book, and I'll put a link to that. What the bleep do we know? Because it's just horrible. Like if you want to see like the worst abuse of like scientific knowledge for the sake of like charlatanism, I definitely recommend that movie. It's just mind-numbing, and I watched 30 minutes. I watched 30 minutes of it last night, and I took notes on kind of like how is this effect being achieved. It basically plays on like all sorts of like. It's basically like the woman is deaf, and she's like taking antidepressants. So it's like trying to pull you in on this level of like dysfunctional people, and like even the fact that they made her like more needy seeming. It's weird. And like the woman who's like the leader of this group talks in a fake Indian accent. It's just horrible stuff. So if anyone's ever seen it, if anyone likes that movie, I'd be really curious why, because I can't comprehend how anybody could sit through that movie. But anyways, that's it. Okay.